welcome to Industry Focus, the show that dives into a different sector of the stock market every day. Today is Wednesday, March the 13th, and we're talking healthcare. I'm your host, Shannon Jones, with a special treat for our listeners today. Motley Explorer's lead advisor, Simon Erickson, and I recently had the privilege of sitting down with Brad Loncar, CEO of Loncar Investments, to discuss investing in one of the hottest areas in biotech right now. That would be China. And I think it's safe to say that Brad Loncar is likely one of the most knowledgeable and honestly nicest biotech investors out there. As an independent biotech investor, Brad uses his extensive experience researching companies to create biotech investment indexes, including a China Biopharma Index, which tracks the performance of a basket of companies leading the way in China. In this interview, Brad shares with us his thoughts about investing in China from a regulatory front, the trends he's keeping an eye on, and where he sees the biggest opportunities for investors. We hope you enjoy this conversation just as much as we did.
Hi, everyone. I'm Motley Explorer lead advisor Simon Erickson, joined by our Healthcare Bureau Chief Shannon Jones, and our special guest this morning is Brad Loncar. Brad is the CEO of Loncar Investments. One of the topics that he's been very interested in lately is following the biopharmaceutical industry of China, which is the topic of our discussion here today. Hey, Brad, thanks so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thanks a lot for having me.
So, Brad, let's dive right in. For anybody that's been following you, you've had the opportunity to spend a lot of time both here in the States and in China talking with CEOs, industry insiders, and investors. Generally, many everyday biotech investors, though, have been scared to invest in Chinese biotech. In your experience when it comes to Chinese biotech, have you noticed a change in investor sentiment?
Yeah, it's still kind of nascent and just beginning, but this is going to be a topic that you can't avoid in the future, in my opinion. So China's biotech sector is having a moment. And the analogy that I like to use is I really think what's going on there is just like what our biotech sector was in the 80s and 90s, meaning it's just being born. There's a few really important changes that are happening there right now that are dramatically changing their biotech sector. Before today, all of their drug development and their healthcare sector was almost entirely generic drugs. And they're starting to shift towards innovation and a biotech sector, and a really good one. I mean, these are companies that are conducting world-class science and trying to develop drugs that are on the cutting edge, are forming up around them. And for purposes of time, I won't go into too much depth, but there's 3 or 4 things that are making that happen. You know, the Chinese government is supporting it and investing in it. They want to shift their economy away from manufacturing to higher value sectors like tech and biotech. They've totally revamped their version of the FDA, which is called the National Medical Products Administration now. And from a stock market perspective, you know, which we like to talk about here, there's a change that's really, I think, the most important thing, and that's what's happened at the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. Before last year, the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, which is where most of the, you know, big globally progressive companies list, had a rule that said if you don't earn revenue, you can't list on our exchange. And if you think about it, that basically described like 95% of biotech companies, because most of them are development stage. And so the Hong Kong Stock Exchange created something called the Biotech Rule last April, and is allowing true biotech companies to list there. And already a handful have happened, and over the coming years, there might be dozens and dozens. So just like there was a big boom of listings and new biotech companies, and, you know, Amgens and Celgenes and Genentechs of the world were IPOs in the 80s and 90s, I think that's exactly what's going on there right now. So you have all these elements coming together at the right place and right time, creating this sector. And getting to your original question, you know, U.S. investors are starting to hear about it because these companies are forming partnerships with U.S. firms and starting to run trials, not just in China, but in the U.S. So you're starting to see it in the news every single day. I think most people are still trying to figure out what's going on, but over time, as this turns into a real big and important biotech sector, it's something that I think biotech investors won't be able to miss and can't ignore. And this is just the very beginning of that.
That's great, Brad. As you mentioned, there's kind of a boom of a whole bunch of new biotech companies. I wanted to ask about maybe one of the pieces holding back that is the people aspect of this. We've heard kind of anecdotally that there's a shortage of qualified people that are available in China to actually run and manage the clinical trials. I know that China's kind of tried to address that with the 1,000 Talents program to kind of attract Western talent, or either from the U.S. or Europe to kind of manage those trials. But have you seen that there still is a shortage of good people to develop new drugs and to run the trials over in China?
Definitely not. That's something that's changed a lot for the better over years as well. I don't think there's a shortage at all. There, like, just as you said, there's a lot of people who have studied in the U.S. and other places in the West and have experience at very high levels in our biotech sector who are returning home and starting these world-class companies. And the universities are really focusing on this area as well. So there's no shortage of talent. Now, developing a drug that gets approved by the FDA is, a pretty unique thing. You can't teach that to somebody in school. And so that requires experience for people who've, gone through it here, or, guidance and teaching from the management teams. But no, there's definitely not a shortage of talent. And in terms of actually conducting clinical trials, I'll give you a crazy statistic. So there's a research organization in China called PharmCube that focuses on our sector. And they recently put out a statistic and a report that showed that there's 800 CROs in China now. Like, literally, like, every year there's like 100 that are formed. And they're major CROs. Like, there's a big one that's really integral to our industry worldwide now, called WuXi AppTech, and a sister company called WuXi Biologics that focuses in the biologic space. And it's really turned into a specialty of theirs. And so I would watch for China to become a leader, if not the leader, in the clinical development of drugs, because they have the scale, they have this great focus on, like, the CRO model, and their institutions there, they have some hospitals and institutions that do, like, 20 times the 20 times the patients that, are like MD Anderson and Memorial Sloan Ketterings of the world see. So it's bound to turn into a big area where, clinical trials are done. And it may be the preeminent place in the world here in a few years.
That's perfect. So you're seeing the CROs in China playing the same role as they do in the U.S. to kind of outsource a lot of the development and the trials and running in China the same way that they do here.
Absolutely. The country, it's, until you really visit it, it's hard to really articulate just the massive scale of everything there. And their CRO industry is just absolutely booming right now. And, the quality of clinical trials has increased, and the regulators' oversight of them has increased. So, like, one thing I focus on a lot, because, I like following on oncology and cancer, a hot thing in the U.S. and worldwide right now, cell therapies like CAR T. Well, there's more cell therapy trials going on in China right now than there are in the U.S. And that's another important aspect to this, is they're approving trials and getting new technologies into clinical trials faster than we are. And a lot of people here have, raised concerns about us losing our edge. There's a famous developer of CAR T treatments, Carl June at the University of Pennsylvania, who's been very outspoken about this, how if we don't work at the same speed as they do, we may lose our edge in some of these really cutting edge technologies like cell therapy and gene therapy. So in many ways, they're starting to have advantages, and the regulation is totally different. Before this year, before the beginning of last year, for example, for cell therapy trials, you didn't even have to file an IND. So an IND is the regulator's approval to start a trial. And, now they're closely matching the process that we have here in the United States. So from all aspects, they're really stepping up their game and really trying to cultivate a world-class clinical trial system and biotech sector around it.
And so, Brad, you've talked a little bit about some of the changes that are happening, but I want to dive deeper into the regulatory framework and their system. What progress has China made with its regulatory review process? And do you think that there are more changes to come that could even make it even better?
Yeah, the biggest thing is they made a big statement about a year ago. There's a consortium of drug development regulators, so the FDA and the EMA and the Japanese regulators. They created a consortium called ICH, which the goal behind it is to create international regulatory standards. And about a year ago, China joined that for the first time. And it was really a statement on that country's part to say, we want to have the same global standards that all of those other places have. And that was a big message to the world. And in addition to that, there's a lot of important changes they've made. So it's really 180 degrees different than it was years ago. There was a famous story in 2015 where this is going to sound like a crazy story. There was like 1,500 open applications at the Chinese FDA back then. And it was mostly for generic drugs. And back then, everything was getting approved and the quality of the applications was very low. And the regulator went back to all of these companies and said, we want you to seriously reconsider all of these applications that you have pending with us. And we're going to change our standards significantly going forward. So if you don't think your existing application is up to, these new standards that we want you to pull it. And out of the 1,600 open applications they had there, 80% of them got pulled. And it literally was like pressing a button in one day saying, we're going to do this totally different going forward. And they've made a lot of other constructive changes since then, just like joining that ICH, and they've caught up on a huge backlog of applications that they had pending there. And they've also started to, just like our FDA, there's very clear and transparent rules and timelines and things that are, written in stone. So if you're a U.S. company and you file an application, you know how long it's going to take and you know what the process is. And they're starting to really clarify all of their rules and regulations and have certainty and transparency added to the mix. And so they're using our FDA and others as a model that they're trying to replicate. And a lot of the leadership there are actually, people who've returned home, having had experience working at our FDA. So the goal is to bring it up to standards and to kind of replicate what we're doing. And they're not 100% there yet, but compared to where they were, back in 2015, it's literally day and night different, and it'll get even better as we go forward.
Brad, I wanted to talk a little bit about reimbursements too. China's got a national reimbursement drug list that's got a couple thousand drugs that are basically covered for anybody in the country. We've seen the data that shows that the drugs that are covered on the NRDL are selling significantly better than those that aren't on that. That's probably not too surprising. But it used to be several years between the amount of time when the NRDL was updated. The new drugs list would come out on this. but we've seen the time frame drop significantly and much more frequently for the new drugs that are actually gaining coverage out there right now. Is this having an impact on how drugs are being created by companies and bringing them to market?
Absolutely. So you're right. I mean, in some cases, it literally used to take like almost a decade for a drug to get approved. And now that's dramatically changed too. We're actually, we're talking, this is being recorded, ironically, on a day where AstraZeneca just announced earnings. And amazingly, AstraZeneca gets 18% of its revenue from China now, and it's even growing. And one of the drugs they highlighted in their earnings report today as an example of how things are changing in China is a lung cancer drug called Tagrisso. And not only was that approved with lightning speed there, but it was put on the national reimbursement list in less than a year. And that's because they have, a lot of urgency to bring these really important, world-class medicines into the country. And so that's another example of something that's dramatically changed, like something that used to take 5 to 10 years now in many cases is taking a year or less. And so that's, when you're a company that's trying to decide whether to make an investment and to bring a drug to that market, that's a huge factor that would encourage you to do that. And so, yeah, it's a perfect example of something that's changed dramatically night and day for the better.
And do you think that it's influencing in any way the types of drugs that companies are developing? I mean, you saw Merck's Keytruda got approval, I think, in like half a year. Opdivo too. PD-1s, broad-based drugs. Is there more of an interest in companies developing those broad labels for China to try to get that national coverage, lots of indications, or are they still also developing kind of those rarer diseases that might not have as much of a broad label to them?
Well, no. So for those, I think what's going on there is last August, the country actually published a list of 46 drugs that they actively want to be approved there. So literally they published a list and said, to all these multinational firms, these are important medicines that we don't have here now that we would love to have. And there's two things they're doing to encourage them to bring them to China that are important reforms. The first is, until about a year ago, one thing that they've changed is they're now allowing foreign clinical trial data as the basis for approval, especially for diseases where there's a big unmet need. So some of the ones that you mentioned, like Keytruda, Merck did not have to run like a gigantic phase 3 trial in China in melanoma to get that approval. Much of the approval was based off of just the existing data that they already had. This AstraZeneca Tagrisso drug was the same. So that's an important incentive to get these companies to come here because they know that they don't have to reinvent the wheel and, basically develop those drugs from scratch, like within the country now, like they would have had to in the past. And then the second thing is, exactly what you asked about, the reimbursement. So I don't think it's really a distinction between like big, broad indications or rare diseases. Like, I think what they want is they want innovative medicines. Right now they have all generic drugs and they want the best things for their families, the same that we have for ours. And so it's really a matter of just having the best medicines and the most impactful medicines. And I don't think the indications really matter because they're approving them for broad indications. And actually just 2 days ago, they just announced a big tax incentive for companies that are developing rare disease drugs. And that was a big boost for the sector on Monday's trading. So they're really focused on everything. Like it's not really about size. It's more about quality.
And so, Brad, as we all know, globally, the debate on drug pricing, continues to take center stage. So can you talk a little bit about China's drug pricing system? And from your perspective, do you see the larger, more global players versus the domestic generic players? I mean, who's going to win that race when it comes to government price controls?
Yeah, so without a doubt, I think eventually it's going to be the domestic players that win. And a good case example of this is Keytruda, which you just brought up. So Keytruda was approved in China for melanoma, 5 or 6 months ago. And then in December, there's a domestic company called Shanghai Junshi Biosciences, which just had its IPO on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange on Christmas Eve. And it has a PD-1 that was also approved for melanoma in China. And you may have heard this didn't make a lot of news. I'm surprised in the U.S. But when Merck got their approval and they announced their pricing, the price of Keytruda was like half of what they're charging globally, and that made a lot of headlines. The price in China is half of what it is in other places. Well, this Chinese competitor, after they got their approval, announced that their price depends on the weight of the patient, but essentially will be either a half or a third of Keytruda's. So the cost, the cost that they're able to produce there and sell these drugs is so much lower than what we're used to here that I think multinationals for many drug categories will be the first ones to have a drug on the market. But as soon as a Chinese competitor is able to get a drug approved and enter a race, it's going to be really hard for those multinationals to compete with them. Now, like the consumers there place a high value on foreign brands. Like one thing that's interesting is even for a lot of drugs where there's a generic available, people who are able to afford it out of pocket or who have insurance sometimes are willing to pay a premium price for the foreign brand. But the thing we're talking about today is, the vast majority of people there get their health care paid for by the national government reimbursement system. And for those, like, there's really going to be like a winner take all. And I think it's going to be hard for multinationals over the very long run to compete with some of these local players just because their costs are so much lower and they're so much more competitive than we're used to thinking about here in the U.S. But the other thing, the other important thing there is scale. A good example of how their reimbursement system works. So like one drug that was recently reimbursed there is Avastin. So that's Roche's, one of Roche's big cancer drugs. And they took, to get on that national reimbursement schedule, like a 70% price haircut. But the country scale is so huge that ever since they got on that, even with that huge price discount, the sales of Avastin have ramped very nicely, and it's going to end up being very lucrative, even given that huge price cut. So that's really how it's going to be there is, companies are going to have to deal with big price cuts. But for those that get approved and on that national reimbursement system, the scale of the country is going to make up for it.
Yeah, and Brad, one thing that you were explaining to us a little earlier is that you are the creator of the Loncar China Biopharma Index. Now, that's not the ETF that people can buy. That's run by someone separately. And the ETF that actually replicates your holdings is CHNA, is the ticker on that. But you're still the one that's in charge of putting the companies into the index and selecting them and judging the weightings and everything else. Our audience here is individual investors. They would certainly have an interest in this, but I wanted to ask you, how do you go about picking the companies that you're putting into the index and also figuring out what kind of allocation you want to put behind each one of them?
Yeah, so the idea here is to give exposure to the entire space. So like here we have in the US, the NASDAQ Biotech Index. for example, and there's like 200 companies in that. And the goal of that is, rather than focusing on an individual company, to follow the industry as a whole. So with this, right now we have 29 companies, and 23 of them are listed in Hong Kong and include some of these new, IPOs, and 6 of them are listed here on the NASDAQ. And that's one thing that I think is really important for people to know, is that there's a handful of really world-class Chinese biotech companies that are listed right here on NASDAQ. So BeiGene and Zai Labs are good examples of companies like that. And so what we do is we limit our exposure to those 2 exchanges, because we view Hong Kong and NASDAQ as, global, transparent, credible exchanges. And we look at every Chinese drug developer or distributor or service provider or diagnostics company that are listed on those 2 exchanges, and we put them in a basket together. And so there's 29 companies like that currently. And the way that we decide the weighting is we have what's called a modified equal weighted methodology. So we take those 29 companies and we start by giving them all the same weight every 6 months. But for companies that have a market value greater than 10 billion, they get a little bit of a higher weighting. For companies that are between 1 and 10 billion, they get a medium weighting. And for companies that are below 1 billion in value currently, they get kind of a smaller weighting. And, that gives credit to the larger companies for their stability and the role that they play in the sector. And we do that process every 6 months. And one thing that has me excited is, with this Hong Kong Stock Exchange rule and this big pipeline of companies that will likely IPO there, right now we have 29 companies in this. And over the coming years, that will grow every 6 months. So, 2 or 3 years from now, that may have, 60 or 70 companies in it. It just all depends on how many Chinese biotech companies list on those 2 exchanges. So yeah, that's how we have it set up. It's a basket of 29 companies, and the idea is that it will, hopefully go up and down as the fortunes of that sector goes up and down. And this is, just like our biotech sector in the 80s and 90s, biotech is volatile, and especially in a place where it's brand new and they're just getting used to it. So it'll have a lot of ups and downs, and it's very scary to focus on individual biotech companies, especially in a case like this where it's a very emerging thing. And so I'm a big fan of taking a macro view of things. And so that's why we've created this, is it allows people to focus on the long-term theme and hopefully the long-term growth without getting too into the weeds of the individual companies and the risks that come along with that.
Yeah, and Brad, you hit the nail on the head. As long-term investors here at the Motley Fool, you really couldn't have said it any better. I guess to close us out today, what should individual investors be watching in this space specifically? Well,
the most important thing, I would get back to saying, you have to have a long-term view of this. Like, if you look at a chart of our biotech sector since the 80s when it was started, it's been a roller coaster, and there's lots of ups and downs. And I think it's important to think of this from that long-term perspective. China has a policy that makes a lot of headlines. It's called Made in China 2025. And that's really, having a big influence on what we're talking about. The goal of that program is to transform their economy to higher value sectors. And they've singled out pharmaceuticals as one of those, that they want to have like a world-class competitive pharmaceutical sector by 2025. And so you see a lot of stories every day about an IPO that was a big success, or an IPO that didn't go very well, or something like that. Or you see, something about, there was a vaccine scandal in China last year, and that made a lot of news. And there's going to be a lot of positive things you hear and a lot of negative things, and it's going to be a roller coaster, just like biotech naturally is. But if you think about all of these important changes that are happening, the investments, the people coming home, starting companies, the food, their version of the FDA, all the reforms there, and, the stock exchange, rule change. If you think of all of those arrows and where they're pointed together all at the same time in the context of what is this going to look like in 2025 or over the long term like that, I think it has a very, promising future. And so the most important advice that I could give is try to think of it from that long-term perspective. This is I think a mega trend that's worth putting on your radar. And think of it that way. Don't get caught up in the individual, news stories or the ups and downs. Try to think of it over the long term like that.
Well, certainly a trend that individual investors should be keeping an eye on. Again, Brad Loncar is the CEO of Loncar Investments. If you want to look more at the ETF that follows his index, tracking biopharmaceuticals in China, the ticker on that again is CHNA. Brad, thanks so much for the time with us here this morning.
It's my pleasure. This has been fun. Thanks for having me.
And for Simon Erickson and Shannon Jones, we appreciate you tuning in. Until next time, Fool on.
Well, that's it for this week's Industry Focus Healthcare episode. Hope you enjoyed the interview with Brad. As always, people on the program may have interest in the stocks they talk about, and the Motley Fool may have formal recommendations for or against. So don't buy or sell stocks based solely on what you hear. This show is produced by Austin Morgan. For Simon Erickson, I'm Shannon Jones. Thanks for listening, and Fool on.